When a corporate cleanup crew shows up at your failing farm with military-grade drones, you know your daughter's environmental nightmare just became your immediate survival problem. Did she come back to save the farm, or just to save her career from the toxic secret buried beneath your cornfields? The dust of July in central Nebraska is a special kind of beast. It doesn't just settle, it integrates. It becomes part of your skin, your lungs, the very grain of the cheap plywood siding on the barn. For 30 years, this dust, this heat, and the smell of rich black soil turning over have been my life. And for the last 5 years, it's been my life, singular. Because Sarah decided she wanted a different kind of dirt under her fingernails. Sarah, my girl. She's brilliant, sharp as a tack, with a mind that sees equations where I see rows of corn. When she was 16, she took her acceptance letter to some fancy university 3 states over, packed 2 suitcases, and didn't look back. "Dad," she'd said, her eyes fixed on a brochure about urban planning, "this isn't my future. I can't spend my life wrestling with broken tractors and praying for rain. I'm going to build things that last." I didn't fight it. How do you fight ambition? I just swallowed the lump in my throat, signed the loan papers for her first year's tuition, money that could have bought a new combine, and told her to call when she missed the sound of the crickets. She called maybe twice a year, always brief. Holidays were a no-go. Too much pressure from me, she'd claim. She was always busy with internships, networking events, or, as she put it, figuring out the complexities of municipal zoning codes. Meanwhile, the complexity I was wrestling with was the ancient hydraulics on the '88 John Deere, and the only code I cared about was the planting depth of winter wheat. This year was brutal. We had a late frost that nipped the early sprouts, followed by a heat wave that baked the topsoil into something resembling concrete. My back, which has carried the weight of this farm since my own father passed, started protesting with blinding pain every morning. I hired summer help, a couple of college kids, but they treated the work like an Instagram story. They'd take pictures of the sunset, then promptly go inside to check their signal strength. They didn't understand that the sunset was the only thing holding the day together. Last Tuesday, I was out behind the old shed, trying to jury-rig a broken fence post that was leaning dangerously close to where the cattle grazed. The post finally gave way with a sickening crack. I tried to brace it with my shoulder, and that's when the lightning struck. Not literal lightning, but the sharp, white-hot electrical shock that shoots down your spine when you overcommit. I crumpled onto the dry grass, clutching my lower back, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thin. I managed to crawl the 20 feet to the ATV parked nearby. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely key the ignition. I drove slowly back to the farmhouse, the pain turning the familiar scenery into a shimmering, distorted nightmare. I got inside, locked the door, a habit ingrained from years of isolation, and collapsed onto the worn floral sofa in the living room. I knew I couldn't call the kids down the road. They'd charge me an arm and a leg for an emergency call-out, and frankly, I was too proud to admit defeat, even to myself. I needed help. Proper, reliable help, and I needed it fast before the next rotation of irrigation pipes seized up. I lay there for an hour, managing to dial the one number I hadn't called in 6 months. It went straight to voicemail. I left a ragged message. "Sarah, it's Dad. Something's wrong. The barn needs attention. I can't manage it. Just call me back when you get this." I hung up, the silence of the house echoing my despair. I closed my eyes, drifting in and out of a feverish haze, convinced I'd be found by the local vet, wondering where the livestock had wandered off to. Then, the silence was brutally interrupted. It wasn't the phone ringing. It was a sound I hadn't associated with this isolated mailbox address for half a decade. The unmistakable high-pitched whine of a modern, very expensive engine idling aggressively just outside the gravel driveway. I dragged myself to the dusty front window, squinting through the grime, praying it wasn't the debt collector finally showing up. What I saw wasn't a battered pickup or an old sedan. It was a sleek, obsidian black SUV, impossibly clean, looking like it had just landed from a corporate parking garage in Chicago. And stepping out from behind the driver's side door, silhouetted against the blinding Nebraska sun, was Sarah. She wasn't wearing denim or practical boots. She was in tailored white linen trousers and sunglasses that hid half her face. She looked like she was about to close a multi-million-dollar deal, not walk into a failing farmstead. She surveyed the overgrown yard, the peeling paint, the slight haze of dust surrounding the porch, and then she did something I didn't expect. She pulled off the sunglasses, revealing eyes that looked tired but fiercely determined, and she didn't walk toward the door. Instead, she strode purposefully toward the massive, looming shadow of the grain silo, pulling a device. It looked too small to be a proper radio, out of a sleek leather satchel, holding it up to her ear. As she spoke into it, her voice, usually soft, carried clearly in the stillness. "Yes, it's the coordinates. I'm on site. Look, Mark, this needs to be handled immediately. The integrity is compromised. Tell the team to prep the drone fleet. We need to assess the structural stability of the main feed pipeline before the evening wind shift. If we wait, we risk total contamination." She paused, listening. Then her jaw tightened. "No, I don't care about the quarterly projections. If this goes sideways, the entire operation collapses. I'll meet you at the perimeter gate in 20 minutes. I have to secure the immediate access points first." She lowered the device and spun around, spotting me at the window. Her composure cracked, replaced by a flash of panic, quickly masked by that familiar, pragmatic focus. She didn't knock. She wrenched open the screen door, stomped into the hallway, and didn't even glance at my pale, pained face on the sofa. She scanned the cluttered kitchen, her expression turning from alarm to outright disgust, before she finally fixed her sharp gaze on me. "Dad," she said, her voice clipped, devoid of the warmth I longed for. "Where is the Blueprints archive? And more importantly, where is the main pressure release valve access point for the secondary holding tank? I need to know exactly what kind of archaic system you're running out here before I can even begin to calculate the fallout." The sudden appearance of my prodigal daughter, smelling faintly of expensive perfume, battling the entrenched odor of mildew and diesel, was jarring enough. But hearing her casually discuss structural integrity, drone fleets, and total contamination in the same breath as my rickety, century-old irrigation system snapped my already frayed nerves. "Blueprints? Sarah, this isn't a skyscraper in Minneapolis," I wheezed, trying to sit up, a motion that sent another wave of fiery agony through my lower back. "We got a handwritten ledger from your grandfather about the plumbing, and the pressure valve is under the south lean-to. What in God's name are you talking about, contamination?" She strode past me into the kitchen, opening the ancient, humming refrigerator with a tentative finger, as if afraid it might bite her. "The contamination, Dad, is why I'm here," she stated, pulling out a bottle of sparkling water, not the lukewarm tap water I kept, and twisting the cap off with unnecessary force. "I've been tracking anomalies in regional agricultural reports for 3 weeks, specific soil composition shifts, unexpected water table depletion in this exact quadrant. It flagged my proprietary risk assessment model." "Risk assessment model?" I repeated dumbly. "Sarah, we had a drought. We're 3 weeks behind on spraying the South 40 because I couldn't lift the hose." She slammed the fridge door shut, finally turning to face me, her eyes blazing with the kind of intensity she used to reserve for winning debate club championships. "This isn't a drought, Dad. This is a slow-motion failure point amplified by neglect. When I was researching sustainable urban water grids last year, I cross-referenced publicly available EPA records with private sensor data streams, the kind the big chemical companies use to monitor runoff. And guess what? This section of the Platte River watershed is showing persistent, concerning levels of industrial effluent intrusion." My blood ran cold, chasing away the feverish heat. Effluent. That meant runoff. That meant something illegal, something toxic was seeping into our water, and therefore into the corn we sold. "That's impossible," I whispered, shaking my head. "We don't use heavy chemicals. We do rotation, minimal till—" "I know what you do, Dad." She cut me off sharply, walking over to the small, dusty office nook where I kept the paper records. She didn't bother with the ledger. Instead, she bypassed the boxes and went straight for a heavy, locked metal cabinet tucked under the desk. "I need the records from 2018, specifically the application logs for the herbicide used on the fallow fields that year, the ones you bought from Peterson's Supply, not the standard co-op order." "Why 2018? I demanded, struggling to find my voice. "What does that have to do with anything now?" "Because the half-life of the compound I suspect is leaching into the aquifer has a significant decay rate over 5 to 7 years. If you use that specific restricted chemical on the fallow ground, then the current high groundwater table, exacerbated by the recent dry spell, is forcing the saturation point to breach the surface now. And if that saturation point hits your main well intake, it'll poison us," I finished, the realization hitting me with the force of a runaway tractor. "Worse," Sarah hissed, her fingers flying over the small keypad she'd pulled from her satchel, a device that looked suspiciously like a high-end lock-picking tool. "It will contaminate the reservoir that feeds 3 downstream communities, including the city where I now work. I'll be professionally ruined before breakfast tomorrow if this gets out without being contained." I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the metallic clicks signaled the old cabinet yielding. She pulled open the drawer, ignoring the brittle, yellowed papers, and plucked out a thin folder labeled P18 fungicide log. "There," she said, pulling out a single sheet. She didn't seem to see me anymore. She was already 2 steps ahead, already running the scenario in her head. "See? Peterson's special blend. I knew it. Dad, this is not a farm emergency. This is an environmental disaster waiting for the wind to shift." She took out a burner phone, another item from the impossibly equipped satchel, and started rapidly inputting data from the log sheet. "I'm contacting my regulatory liaison now. We need to seal off the well, drill a containment trench, and deploy a neutralizing agent before the sun sets. That means heavy equipment, specialized drilling rigs, and a hazmat perimeter." She paused her typing, looking up at the ceiling, listening intently to the sound of the wind beginning to pick up outside. "The timeline is tight. I need those heavy rigs here in under an hour, which means they'll need clear access and a staging area." She turned back to me, her expression hard, professional, and utterly remote. "Where is the main access road permit filed? I need the zoning codes for emergency environmental mitigation so my team can override local jurisdiction warnings." I stared at her, the pain in my back momentarily forgotten, replaced by a stinging hurt in my chest. She hadn't asked about my health, hadn't even offered me a glass of water from the tap. She came back not for her father, the man who scraped by to send her away, but but for the legal documentation that would save her career from a toxic spill originating on my land. "Sarah," I started, my voice cracking. "I'm hurt. I need a doctor." She didn't even blink. "A doctor will take you to the county hospital, which will file a report, which will trigger the state EPA, which takes 48 hours. We don't have 48 hours. I need the permit file now." Then the sound that confirmed all my fears returned, louder this time. It wasn't just the wind. It was a deep subterranean groan coming from the direction of the cornfields, followed by a sickeningly wet, sloshing sound that suggested a huge volume of liquid had just found a new, unintended path. Sarah's face went slack. She dropped the burner phone on the counter. "That," she breathed, looking toward the window, her voice now laced with genuine terror, "was not the well. That sounded like the primary overflow pipe for the old cistern next to the creek bed." She snatched up her phone, frantically trying to call someone, anyone, named Mark, but the screen remained blank. "No service," she muttered, glancing wildly around the farmhouse's thick stone walls. The pressure surge must have taken out the repeater tower on Route 12. She looked at me, the brilliant urban planner suddenly trapped in the primitive reality of failing infrastructure. "Dad," she commanded, her voice strained, "the truck keys, now. We have to get out there before the creek floods the lower fields. If that contaminated water breaches the main road culvert, the state will shut down the entire valley. I need you to drive." But as she reached for the key ring hanging near the door, a massive shadow fell across the window, followed by a sound like tearing metal and splintering wood. Through the dusty glass, I saw not the silhouette of one of the contractor drones she'd mentioned, but something far, far larger, a massive, dark shape rising above the height of the silo, and I could just make out the distinct jagged outline of industrial digging equipment that looked nothing like what Sarah had called for. It was already moving, not toward the containment zone, but directly toward our house. The shadow that engulfed the living room window wasn't cast by a construction vehicle. It was too organic, too jagged for any standard piece of equipment I'd ever seen on a farm or a city work site. It moved with an unnerving, heavy deliberation. Sarah froze, her hand hovering inches from the keys, her corporate composure utterly shattered. She wasn't looking at the equipment anymore. She was staring at the defunct burner phone in her hand, then back at the window, a dawning comprehension mixed with pure dread on her face. "That's not my team," she whispered, backing away slowly from the door. "That's not Mark's fleet. Those vehicles, those schematics belong to Omnicorp's proprietary extraction units. They're Black Ops heavy recovery. They move fast, they don't file permits, and they certainly don't take calls." "Omnicorp?" I managed, finally finding the strength to push myself up onto my elbows, ignoring the searing protest from my spine. "They're the ones dumping the effluent. You said you were tracking their runoff." "Yes, their runoff," she ground out, her eyes darting to the ledger still clutched in my other hand. "But if they know we've identified the source, they won't just wait for the EPA. They'll perform a catastrophic cleanup." Catastrophic cleanup. That meant erasing the evidence, and given the sound shaking the very foundations of the farmhouse, erasing the source of the evidence, us was probably on the agenda. The ground vibrated intensely, and a deafening hydraulic hiss ripped through the air, immediately followed by the sickening crunch of the old oak out by the mailbox being snapped in half. "The truck!" Sarah yelled, finally snapping into action, but she wasn't heading for my beat-up Ford Ranger. She bolted toward the back door, shouting over the escalating noise. "The secondary survey vehicle! The one I used last summer for the subsurface mapping project. It's electric, silent, and it's buried under the tarp in the potting shed. Get the keys, Dad, hurry. She was organized, efficient, treating this disaster like a hostile takeover in progress. I realized with a strange mix of anger and reluctant admiration that this was the first time in 5 years she had treated this farm, my world, as something worth saving, not just something to escape. I scrambled off the couch, grabbing the keys from the hook. My bad back screamed a warning, but the sound of a massive claw ripping into the tin siding of the old potting shed drowned out the pain. "The shed's compromised," I roared, throwing the keys toward her. Sarah didn't flinch at the destruction. She caught the keys one-handed, sprinted toward the opposite end of the house, and fumbled with the back door lock. "We need the data!" The fungicide log is the primary physical evidence linking the initial contamination to their... Before she could finish, the heavy armored tread of one of the Omnicorp excavators swung around the corner of the house. It was immense, dark green, and entirely too close. It wasn't digging, it was sweeping, clearing a path. The driver, a helmeted figure who looked more like a SWAT officer than a construction worker, didn't even pause to check the resistance. The machine's massive rotating bucket slammed into the side of the house, right where the dining room met the kitchen. Plaster exploded inward, showering us with dust, shattered glass, and the remnants of the ceramic rooster collection my mother loved. Sarah screamed, but it wasn't a scream of fear. It was a shout of pure, tactical frustration. She shoved me hard toward the floor, shielding me with her own body as a second volley of debris rained down. "The data!" she coughed, pointing back to the office nook where the open ledger lay exposed on the floor, illuminated by the sudden shaft of blinding daylight pouring through the new hole in the wall. If they get that log, we have no proof it was their chemical leaching years ago. They can just blame your outdated farming practices for the current breach. I stared at the ledger, then at the impossible machine tearing apart my home. The driver was retracting the bucket, preparing for the killing blow, a complete collapse of the structure. "Go!" I yelled, kicking out wildly at the treads with my good leg. A pathetic gesture. "Get to the survey vehicle. I'll grab the book." Sarah hesitated for a fatal fraction of a second, her eyes locked on the ledger, weighing the value of the evidence against her own safety. She seemed to make a decision based on the cold logic of liability. She turned and sprinted toward the back of the house, heading for the supposed potting shed and the silent electric vehicle. I scrambled toward the office nook, ignoring the throbbing in my back, reaching for the file. My fingers closed around the brittle paper just as the vibration reached its crescendo. I yanked the ledger free, hugging it to my chest, and turned back toward the door, planning to follow Sarah. But the way was blocked. The driver of the Omnicorp machine had anticipated my move. The excavator's massive arm swung back, not for the structure this time, but aimed low, directly at the floor where I was standing, pinning me against the remains of the wall. Then the bucket began to descend slowly, deliberately, effectively creating a heavy, metallic cage around me, sealing me into the wreckage of my own living room. Through the bars of the bucket, I could see Sarah burst out the back door, sprinting toward the potting shed area, her silhouette momentarily framed against the afternoon sun. She didn't look back. She was gone, disappearing into the tall, dry grass. Then the heavy machinery operator leaned forward in his cab, and the thick, reinforced glass of his viewport allowed me a clear look at his face, or rather the complete lack thereof. The helmet was seamlessly smooth, reflecting the ruined Nebraska sky, offering no hint of humanity, no confirmation of who he was working for. And as the bucket's crushing weight finally settled, Pinning my legs to the floorboards, I heard not another hydraulic hiss, but a low, synthesized voice emanating not from the machine, but directly from the metal bars inches from my face. Access denied, Mr. Miller. The contamination evidence remains property of Omnicorp. The synthesized voice vibrating through the metal bars was chillingly calm, entirely devoid of inflection, like a customer service bot delivering terminal news. Access denied. My heart hammered against my ribs, struggling to keep pace with the sudden, desperate realization. Sarah hadn't just left me behind for the evidence. She had left me behind because she needed me alive long enough to be the decoy. She needed the Omnicorp heavy unit focused on the primary target, me, the owner of the incriminating paperwork, while she secured the escape route and her silent electric vehicle. The bucket settled heavier, and a sharp, nauseating crack echoed from my left leg. I cried out, dropping the ledger, which now lay just out of reach under the crushing weight of the steel jaw. "The ledger!" I gasped, fighting against the crushing pressure. "You want the ledger!" The synthesized voice replied instantly, confirming my worst suspicion. The fungicide application log from the 2018 fallow period is the only item of interest. Secure the asset, then neutralize the contamination source. Neutralize the source. That was me. Outside, the sounds of Sarah's desperate scramble grew fainter, swallowed by the rustle of dry corn stalks. She was making for the shed, clinging to the hope that the survey vehicle was still untouched, still silent. I had to distract it. I had to buy her seconds, maybe minutes before that black SUV, her ticket back to her clean, logical world, was found. With a surge of adrenaline fueled by betrayal and agony, I ignored the blinding pain in my leg and lunged for the only thing within reach. The thick, dust-caked cord of the old landline phone, miraculously still dangling from the wall socket near the shattered doorframe. I wrapped the cord tightly around my wrist, gripping the receiver. "You want the log?" I yelled at the silent helmet, spitting out a mouthful of dust and grit. "You can have it when I'm done talking to the authorities." I jammed the receiver against my ear. There was a faint, familiar crackle of connection. The old farm line was still miraculously active, powered by some ancient, stubborn circuit buried underground. I didn't dial 911. I dialed the only number I knew she'd answer, the one number she'd been avoiding for 5 years. My own cell phone, the one she thought was off. It rang once, twice, echoing strangely in the sudden silence from the Omnicorp machine, which seemed to pause, its massive hydraulics holding steady. Then, a weary, familiar voice answered on the other end of the landline. It was Sarah. She must have grabbed her primary smartphone, the one that actually had service outside the farmhouse, and forwarded the call to my neglected landline number at the first sign of trouble. "Dad? Did you get the keys? Where are you? I can't reach Mark, and the shed door is ripped off its hinges." She started, her voice tight with forced control. "Don't move, Sarah," I screamed into the receiver, forcing the words past my constricted throat. "Don't go near that vehicle. They found you. They're here." There was a beat of silence on her end, a silence so profound I could hear the labored mechanical whirring of the Omnicorp excavator, preparing to resume its crushing action. "Who is here, Dad? Did the local contractors show up? What are you talking about?" "Omnicorp. They aren't just trying to cover up the leaks, Sarah. They're trying to erase the witness. They're going to bury me with the proof." I shoved my free hand against the cold metal of the excavator bucket, pushing with all my might, trying to create space, trying to buy time for her to understand. "They know you tracked the 2018 chemical. They know you're the reason this is blowing up now. "No, that's impossible," she breathed, the professionalism gone, replaced by the sound of genuine, terrified panic. "My regulatory models have ironclad anonymity protocols. They couldn't trace the origin of the data breach back to me this fast. They don't need to trace the data, Sarah. They just needed to know someone was tracing it." I looked down at the ledger lying just below the crushing grip. "They knew you'd come back for the evidence. They were waiting." As I spoke, the synthesized voice inside the excavator shifted tone, becoming almost conversational, yet infinitely colder. "Mr. Miller, your daughter has abandoned the primary objective. She is attempting to access an unregistered utility vehicle. Cease communication and cooperate with evidence retrieval." The machine began to move again, but this time, it wasn't crushing me immediately. It lifted slightly, just enough to create a gap, and the bucket began to tilt, its massive, serrated edge aimed precisely at the ledger on the floor. It was going to scoop up the evidence and leave me pinned beneath the frame. "Sarah, they're taking the book!" I yelled into the receiver. On the other end, I heard a sudden, frantic, metallic clatter, the sound of the survey vehicle alarm being triggered, followed immediately by the distinct, sharp thump of a heavy door slamming shut, presumably the door to the shed, or perhaps the vehicle itself. "I have it, Dad," Sarah's voice crackled back, suddenly clearer, infused with a terrifying, desperate energy. "I have the vehicle, but I can't get service to the emergency beacon from in here. I need you to hold them off. Just keep them talking." Then the sound of that pristine black SUV starting up, silent, electric, deadly, was instantly drowned out by a massive, coordinated volley of noise from the area around the potting shed. Not the hydraulic hiss of the excavator, but the deep thrum of heavy rotors rapidly accelerating. I strained my neck, looking past the massive excavator arm pinning me down toward the open back field. 3 large military-grade drones, their hulls matte black and utterly silent until they hit full throttle, were ascending from the vicinity of the shed, their undercarriages glowing with the faint, ominous light of activated sensors. And they weren't heading for the sky. They were vectoring directly toward the single tiny patch of dry earth where Sarah's silent survey vehicle was making its getaway. They were locking on. The final piece of evidence, Sarah herself, was about to be intercepted, and I was trapped, an immobilized spectator in the ruins of my own home, watching my daughter's escape vector converge with a weaponized swarm. The sight of those drones, sleek, deadly geometry against the bruised twilight sky, snapped something loose in me. It wasn't just fear, it was the final blinding realization of what I had lost when I let her leave. I hadn't just lost a daughter to the city. I'd lost her to a world where people like Omnicorp operated with impunity, and where my warnings were nothing more than background noise until they directly threatened her carefully constructed future. "Sarah, get out of there. They're deploying air support," I screamed into the phone, my voice raw, the receiver momentarily forgotten as I focused everything on the retreating shape of the survey vehicle, now just a dark smear against the horizon where the drones were closing fast. Inside the excavator cage, the synthesized voice registered my outburst with chilling detachment. The secondary asset is confirmed mobile, engaging retrieval sequence Delta 9. Mr. Miller, cease agitation. Your retention is no longer required once the ledger is secured. The operator inside the behemoth was clearly overriding the primary objective, me, to focus on the immediate threat to Omnicorp's long-term interests, Sarah, and the evidence she possessed. The pressure on my legs eased fractionally as the machine's attention shifted its enormous mass toward the field. This was my chance. The pressure lifted enough for me to throw my entire weight sideways, ignoring the agonizing tear in my muscle. The ledger, slick with sweat and dust, slid out from under the massive claw. I snatched it, clutching the 2018 application logs to my chest like a shield. Now I had to gamble everything on the only leverage I possessed, the very data they were willing to destroy my home and potentially my daughter for. I jammed the phone back to my ear. "Sarah, stop the car, don't keep running." "I can't, Dad. They're gaining altitude, they're firing countermeasures," she screamed back. I could hear the whine of the drones intensify, a high tearing sound that suggested physical engagement. "They want the book," I yelled, turning my attention back to the silent, unreadable helmet staring at me through the steel bars. "You want this back? You want your reputation clean? Then let's talk terms, because I am about to make sure every regulatory agency in this state and the next 3 knows exactly what's on these pages." I didn't wait for the synthesized reply. I used the remaining strength in my uninjured arm to grab the thick cord connecting the receiver to the wall, ripping the entire apparatus free from the plaster with a violent, tearing sound. I was holding a severed wire, the phone receiver dangling uselessly. With reckless abandon, I aimed the exposed copper wire at the massive exposed hydraulic lines running along the exterior housing of the excavator arm, the very lines that controlled the bucket pinning me down. If there was one thing I knew about old, overworked, heavy machinery, it was that direct electrical interference near high-pressure conduits usually resulted in an immediate, messy shutdown, or worse, catastrophic failure. "Listen to me, Omnicorp," I roared, pushing my face close to the bars, directly addressing the silent operator. "The price for this data just went up. You back off those drones, you let my daughter go, and you get this file. But you do it by sending a licensed, verifiable human representative with a full signed affidavit agreeing to fund the complete remediation of the river contamination, supervised by my chosen environmental firm, not yours." I jabbed the exposed copper end of the cord against the thickest hydraulic line I could reach. A brilliant blue-white spark erupted, followed by a loud pop that sounded like a gunshot in the relative quiet of the evening. The excavator shuddered violently. The synthesized voice cut out mid-sentence. The massive arm, which had been holding me in place with tons of hydraulic force, suddenly went slack. The bucket dropped, not quickly, but with a slow, grinding sigh of depressurized failure, hitting the ground just inches from my trapped legs. The sudden release of pressure sent me sprawling onto the splintered floorboards, the ledger tumbling away but remaining safely within my grasp. The drone swarm above Sarah's vehicle, which had been closing for the final interception, suddenly tilted. The lead drone wobbled, its navigation systems clearly affected by the electromagnetic pulse from the failing hydraulics. They stopped chasing, hovering erratically, confused by the lack of central command and the sudden, overwhelming electromagnetic noise generated by the defunct Omnicorp machine. I didn't have time to celebrate. I clawed my way toward the gaping hole in the wall where the excavator bucket had been moments before. I pushed myself through the opening, ignoring the blinding pain, ignoring the wreckage, dragging the ledger. I crawled 20 yards toward the edge of the property, where the tall, dry corn offered momentary concealment. I pulled out my cell phone, the one Sarah thought was off, which I kept charged for emergencies. Miraculously, near the edge of the tree line, one bar of service flickered to life. I didn't call the police. I didn't call a lawyer. I called the one person whose career Sarah had mentioned earlier, her regulatory liaison, Mark. "Mark, this is Sarah's father." I gasped into the phone, the sound of the idling, disabled excavator still audible behind me. I have the physical evidence of Omnicorp's illegal chemical application from 2018. I also have a real-time feed of 3 of their unregistered retrieval drones currently hovering over my daughter, who is attempting to escape in a black survey vehicle on the North 40. You have exactly 30 seconds to get a legitimate federal seizure team deployed to this location, or I upload this ledger to every agricultural watchdog site in North America. Your call, Mark, but I'm done praying for rain. I hung up immediately, knowing the threat, coming from the source of the contamination itself, held more weight than any frantic call from Sarah. I didn't wait for a response. I turned back toward the farmhouse, seeing the shadow of the disabled excavator loom large and inert against the darkening fields. I was trapped, injured, and surrounded by the evidence of my own past mistakes. But as I watched the drone swarm finally begin to retreat, scattering back toward the darkness, I saw a faint light, the steady, low beam of a vehicle moving slowly, purposefully, back toward the relative safety of the tree line. Sarah. I pulled myself up onto one knee, favoring my good leg, clutching the ledger, realizing that in coming back for what she needed, she had, however briefly and disastrously, remembered the father she'd left behind. But now, the real fight, the one involving federal agencies and Omnicorp's army, was just beginning, and I was the first domino they had tried to knock over. I just hoped my final desperate move had bought her enough time to actually use the evidence I had protected.